All right, there we go. I've started my timer. So let the lecture begin. Today what I'm going to talk about is a brief review of some of the older theories of persuasion. And then I want to talk about the current theory of persuasion that's recognized as the one that works, the one that explains a lot of other problems, and resolves a lot of contradictions between conflicting evidence about what does and does not work in the field of persuasion. I just want to start by saying that, you know, there are many forms of discourse and approaches towards using communication to convince people that come from various cultures, and they certainly also come from cultures like India and China, where there's been substantial examination of these, and but the basis for the Western approach to persuasion really begins with Aristotle, and he, really just through observation is the first one who came up with various ideas of how to persuade and how to argue, and he did that by observing those around him. He studied with Plato, and then he was appointed by Alexander to as a teacher and a tutor. The principal book that concerns these particular theories is the Rhetoric, and he said that there were three different ways that you could try to persuade people, and these are ethos, pathos, and logos. And let's just start by mentioning what they are. Ethos is your credibility, or why anyone would want to believe you, your charisma, or your ability to convince people that you mean well, that you are an honest person, that you're sincere, and all of those things go into making up credibility. Later on, we'll study credibility and its concepts from a more empirical framework, but, you know, Aristotle was the one who said that ethos is important. Second, pathos, and this is the use of emotion and appeal to virtue and the manipulation of the feelings of the audience, that often you can use that to persuade them, and we'll see that that's true as well. Now, third is logos, and that's logic, reasoning. You make arguments, you try to demonstrate logically, reasonably, that something is true or should be true, and that should convince the audience. And, you know, for literally century after century after century, Aristotle was sort of the final word in persuasion, and he has some things called topoi, or common appeals you can make, and examples of clever arguments, but that was pretty much it. Yes, there was some re-examination in the late Middle Ages, but it didn't go very far. But everything really changed after World War II. And the reason that happened is because in the events that led up to World War II and what happened during World War II, a situation arose where highly intelligent, highly educated populations were persuaded to do some pretty incredible things. And basically, this was one of the realities of fascism. You have countries like Italy, Japan, and Germany where there had been, where people were reasonable. They weren't monsters. They, wanted the best for people. But through the process of persuasion and some pretty impressive persuaders and tactics, and basically, the whole concept of propaganda comes from this era, people were persuaded to support regimes and support actions and participate in incredible crimes against humanity. Whether it's the rape of Nanjing or the death camps at Auschwitz, there were educated people who were persuaded to do some incredibly inhuman things. And so all of a sudden, after World War II, especially in the United States, there was a very strong emphasis on we need to figure out how persuasion works, how we can manipulate, how we can protect, and how we can be aware of these things, because hopefully the evil persuasion that occurred during fascism will not come again. The result is that the Department of Defense, oddly enough, the Department of Defense started funding lots of studies. And, the studies started to produce different kinds of results and findings. And so a number of different theories developed. And all of the theories had some empirical foundation. Sometimes the theories would predict correctly that people would be persuaded, and sometimes they wouldn't. The attitude change theory talked about, the cognitive elements I've been talking about, and then tried to say, what the relationship was between them, what's the relationship of the content, the communicator, the kinds of evidence used, etc., etc. But this started to generate a lot of problems because they found a lot of contradictory evidence. Sometimes using more information in your persuasive appeal was successful, sometimes it had no effect, and sometimes it was counterproductive. And so increasingly in their studies, they found that they had this contradictory information and findings. And so they tried to find out why this was happening. And so there was a group of other theories that developed. There was consistency theories, tried to look at people's desire to maintain consistency in their cognitive elements, and we've talked about that. You don't want to hold contradictory beliefs. You want everything to fit together, but some people have the drive for consistency more than others. And while there were some interesting findings there, it wasn't a full-blown theory of persuasion. There were learning theories where people tried to look at how people learn, that persuasion maybe is sort of like learning, and our theories of learning could be adapted to persuasion. Once again, there's some useful information, but no full-blown theory. Then there were mass media effects theories, the notion that people have a common source of information in the late 20th century generated by the media. Media dependence makes us vulnerable to propaganda, distortion of reality. There was significant evidence that distraction of the audience could be very effective. And the whole concept of selective exposure, that you listen to some things but won't listen to others, and that for some people, media persuasion can overwhelm us, and you decide just to shut out as many sources of persuasion as you can. But, once again, useful findings, no full-blown theory. Finally, the constructivist theories began with the assumption that people behave differently, and we need to focus on the individual person in the audience to determine why they behave in a certain way, why some messages work and others don't. And a lot of this research was carried out through focus group interviews. You would take a representative group of people, you would show them some kind of persuasive message, and then afterwards they would fill out an instrument, I change my mind, I don't change my mind, whatever, and then have interviews with them about it. Once again, a lot of good knowledge, but no theory of persuasion. In the beginning of the 1980s, some couple of investigators decided to start to construct a completely new theory. And what they really wanted was one that was able to predict when people would be persuaded, one that would allow you to control whether people were persuaded, and a theory that allowed you to understand why these things happen. And they kept building up a body of information, and in 1986, their book was published, two guys named Petty and Cacioppo. And I believe your reading assignment for today is to read the chapter from their book where they outline their basic theory of persuasion. Now, one of the really good things that has happened is that this particular theory has been able to explain the contradictory findings that really disturbed people so much when they started studying persuasion right after World War II. Why is it that more evidence is more effective sometimes, has no effect at others, and in others is productive to use. And they were able to take a lot of old evidence and old studies by re-examining the results in the light of their theory. Then they were able to explain why it happened. So finally we were able to understand this contradictory information, and that really helped people to accept it, because it explained what were empirically valid studies and why they had such different results. This model of persuasion is called the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, or the ELM. It's not a particularly good name. I don't particularly like it. I would have given it a name far more snazzy, and maybe I'll be asking a question, what's a better name for the ELM later on. But the ELM is based on a number of principles that build on themselves to create a structure within which you can try to do those three things we really wanted: to understand how persuasion works, to predict when persuasion will or will not work, and to control, right? That you can fit, if you analyze the audience correctly and the message and put it together, then you are able to persuade people. This theory has since been adopted by political campaigns, advertising campaigns, all kinds of instances of where people are trying to be persuaded. So what I'd like to do is to look at this particular theory and go through the 8 precepts of it. I don't know if I'm going to get through all 8 in this particular lecture. If not, we have next Tuesday. And then for the rest of the time next Tuesday, I want to talk about how do you apply this to given situations. And we'll do some thought experiments and maybe some exercises about designing persuasive attempts using the elaboration likelihood model. So, here are the 8 precepts. Let's go through them one at a time. The first precept is people want to hold correct beliefs and attitudes. People want to hold correct beliefs and attitudes. Nobody wants to believe things that are wrong, I guess, unless you're psychotic. Nobody wants to, have a strongly held opinion that's absolutely ridiculous or totally false. Everyone is motivated by wanting to have beliefs and attitudes that they feel are correct. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that they actually are correct. It just means that they think they're correct. And if people discover that something they believe is absolutely incorrect, then they'll want to change it. But it's not whether it's really correct, it's whether they think it is. And I think there's an interesting concept here that I find useful, and that's the notion of whether something is psycho-logical. Now, you all know the word psychological, but I'm using this a little differently. I'm putting a hyphen between psycho-logical. Now, things could be logical, and the assumption there is that there's some framework and theory of logic that you can apply that's external to the person. But the idea of psycho-logical just says people think that it's logical. People think that it makes sense, and I think it's important to maintain that distinction, because people want to believe what they think is correct. That doesn't mean it is correct. It doesn't mean they're being logical, but it means that they think they are, and that's the important thing. Because in persuasion, often perception is reality. So almost all people want to hold correct beliefs and attitudes, and that's the first precept of the ELM. The second one is that motivation to think. Now, the word they use for think is elaboration. Because when you think about something, you take a basic concept, or like, how can the Yankees get better? Well, and you elaborate on it. Well, they could use more pitching, they could trade this player, they need a new manager, whatever. So you think about it. When you think about something, you do sort of elaborate it. You explore different parts of it, different ideas. But their idea here is that people's motivation to elaborate or think varies with individuals and situations. Right? Some people love to think. For me, for example, thinking is my fun time. For me, thinking is recreation. Thinking is living. Right? I'm thinking about something. I'm, doing that. But that doesn't mean that everybody's like that. Some people don't particularly want to do a lot of thinking about things, and some people, maybe you had a hard day at an alienating, repetitive assembly line job, or making as a barista, making endless lattes all day. Maybe you just want to come home and sit down and have a beer and watch the football game. You don't really want to think, right? And I'm sure you've heard the expression, no, 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 I don't want to think about that, right? And that's when someone just doesn't want to. Now, there are two different elements to this. Some people, they particularly don't want to do a lot of thinking, right? So they think when they need to and when it's necessary, but otherwise, they just like to chill. Other people are very situational, right? They don't want to think about they don't want to think about things unless they cross the threshold of being meaningful for them. Let's face it. If you walk out into the world in the morning and you're exposed to things, messages, the birds singing, whatever, you cannot elaborate or think about everything. You cannot attend to, think about, and elaborate about everything. So what you do is you pick those things that you're willing to think about. Maybe you're in the mood for thinking about, wildlife. So you watch the squirrels and watch the birds or the cockroaches or whatever, right? I'm thinking I'll do some bird watch today, or I want to think about traffic, and so I'll watch that. So, we decide at different points to think about things more or less in different situations. And I'm sure you've heard the expression, I don't want to think about that. Right? It's pretty self-evident. They don't want to think about it. But generally, we'll think about things as they interest us, as we think it's important. If I told you I have a new idea that will help you cut your college loan burden in half, many of you would be highly motivated to hear me talk about it. You'd be glad to think about that. Many UVM students have high loan burdens. And, oh boy, I could reduce that. That would be awesome. So you would pay attention to it. If I said, I want to talk to you about some, interesting rock formations on Neptune. It's like, okay. Will I have to work very hard at thinking about it? It's not very relevant to you. It's not very important. The point is that people tend to conserve their cognitive resources. They conserve their cognitive resources. They use them when they need them, right? Some people spend their cognitive resources gladly. Let's think about a lot of stuff. Others don't. But all of us are situational, in which we think about things or elaborate about things to the extent that we think they're interesting and important to us. And that's a very important precept of the ELM model of persuasion. Third point. There are variables that can influence persuasion. There are variables that can influence persuasion. And there are three such variables. The first variable is persuasive arguments. Reasons, evidence, logical connections. You can be influenced by that, right? You can be influenced by arguments, reasoning. I mean, we talked about the theory of reasoned action, and humans are quite often, trying to be reasonable. Of course, this is psycho-logical. People always think that, if they think that the arguments are reasonable, that's all you need. It's not whether they are or not. Okay? So that's the first thing that can influence persuasion, persuasive arguments. The next category of things, they have given the title peripheral cues. Peripheral cues, with cues being C-U-E-S. Now, a cue, if you don't know, is, if I'm directing a movie and I might cue the actors, okay, enter the camera. Now, cut, stop. I sort of give advice or direction. And peripheral cues are a bunch of other things that can influence persuasion. Images, the identity of the speaker, the previous ideas that the audience has, and mental shorthand that is often used. Let's look at some of those. Images. Images can be some of the most powerful persuasion forces that exist. That's why you get those pictures of starving children. That's why you get, pictures of a number of things that can really influence you. And the picture's not necessarily making an argument, but it is something that can affect you. If I am giving a speech about vegetarianism and I am at the same time showing big pictures behind me of animals being tortured, mutilated, slaughtered, and mistreated, that's going to have an effect on the message that I'm giving. So images can be important. Speaker identity. Speaker identity can be very important. There are many factors about a speaker. You could be attractive. You could be ugly. You could be famous. You could be unknown. You could have a track record of honesty and reliability. You could have a track record of being a swindling, nasty criminal, right? And so it makes a difference whether the persuasive message is presented by Paris Hilton or Albert Einstein, right? The message, the presenter of the message makes a difference. So this also is a peripheral cue. There are previous positions. What the receiver of the message, what the audience already believes. If I'm going to give a speech about women need the right to choose an abortion or not, that should be the woman's decision, then, the previous positions of the audience could be very important. If I'm speaking to a group from Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, their previous position they're pro a woman's right to choose. If I'm speaking to a group of nuns at the at a parish at a Catholic church in Hanover, New Hampshire, that's quite a bit different because their previous position is that they think abortion is wrong. Okay, and so the previous position can be also a peripheral cue. Finally, we have mental shorthand. We have mental shorthand. And mental shorthand sort of works like this. Some things you're just accepting. You're not thinking about them. You don't think them through. You're just accepting them. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Want $20? Sure. You don't think about, okay, do I need $20? What would I use it for? Would it be bad for me what I spent it on, etc. Now, you would just take the money because we have decided that money is good. We want money. And so you have this mental shorthand. You don't think about it. You just say, I want, money. Fine. And the way I often describe these these sort of mental shorthand things is by, I don't want to give the cavemen a hard time, but, you grunt, which indicates, money good. Right? Instead of thinking through, well, what would I use it for? Would it be bad for me? Why would I have it? Etc., etc. You just think, money? Money good. Another example. And this is, you often see this in advertising. They use this kind of, want another beer, chief? Beer good. Right? So I'll just take one. You don't think about, you don't so much think about, what's the story behind beer? And so, but likewise, it's the same. Do you love your children? Love kids. Right? Do you not like your mother-in-law? Don't like mother-in-law. Right? And so there's this mental shorthand that you have, and quite often this is a peripheral cue that can be effectively manipulated. By using this mental shorthand, you can get them to accept things without thinking them through necessarily. So those are the peripheral cues. Images, speaker identity, previous positions, mental shorthand. Okay? Now this is sort of the soft side of persuasion. Right? Why do you think that they have to have a beautiful and or handsome movie star to recommend some product? Because the product may not be very good. There may not be, remember our first way that you could persuade people through persuasive arguments, reasons, evidence, logical connections, things like that. Right? Sometimes there isn't much reason why you should buy the Popeil wallet stuffer, or some kind of new food chopper, or the magical ultra effective Ginsu knife, and so you have to have other reasons, and those other reasons you might use would be peripheral cues. The third variable that can impact persuasion is the extent and direction of elaboration or thinking. The extent or direction of elaboration. Now let's think about this. First is the extent of elaboration. How much are people going to think about what you're saying? How much are they going to elaborate about it? Right? And if they're going to elaborate a lot about it, then you need to be more careful than if they're not going to think much about it. Right? This is the thing about mental shorthand. They don't think about that. Beer good. Right? That's not much elaboration going on there. Right? So there's the extent of elaboration. Then there's the direction of elaboration. There's the direction of elaboration. And there are two possible directions for elaboration once you get people thinking. You can have biased elaboration or objective elaboration. Biased elaboration or objective elaboration. Let's start with biased elaboration. Now remember, elaboration is thinking about something, and you elaborate on it. You explore it more deeply when you think about it. In biased elaboration, you think about all the reasons why you think a certain way now. For example, if you're a Republican and I get you thinking about, the qualities of a president and what you want in a president, you're likely to name a number of things that are about Republican candidates. Right? You have biased elaboration. And generally, people have biased elaboration when there's not too much at stake, it's not too important to them. So they just think about, all right, what do I already accept as arguments that support the position I already have? That's biased elaboration. Objective elaboration is different. That's where you would come up with all the reasons for or against what you currently believe. Let's say you're a Republican. You say, okay, let's think about it. John McCain. Let's think about all the good things about John McCain. That would just be biased elaboration. But if you have objective elaboration, you would also look at bad things about John McCain. And then, so to make a decision, you would look at the good and the bad, and then sort of make a decision. Well, I'm a Republican, but do I really want to vote for John McCain? And so, that becomes an issue. So I think you can see with this, with biased elaboration, you can reinforce what people already believe, but to the extent that you need them to change their minds, you want to get them to objective elaboration. And objective elaboration is more difficult. I mean, let's think about it. Remember the second precept. People conserve their cognitive resources, right? They don't want to think about it unless they have to. Well, a biased elaboration is much easier to do than objective elaboration, because you just have to think about the things you've already decided why John McCain is cool. And you don't have to dredge up a bunch of others as well. But, if somebody said that, if John McCain, if your choice for the president is wrong and that person doesn't run the country very well, I'm going to shoot your house pets. Well, you'd be highly motivated, given how much you love Fluffy. You'd be highly motivated to make the right decision. Right? Now, also, it's shown that when the country is, in studies of voter behavior, when the country is facing a crisis or in trouble, voters really think about things deeply, much more deeply. They engaged in objective elaboration. But when times are going good, everything's fine, they don't, right? Because biased elaboration is much easier. You just think about what you already believe. So this is the third concept of this model, that there are variables that can impact persuasion. Let's just review them again. Persuasive arguments, which are reasons, evidence, logical connections. Peripheral cues, images, speaker identity, previous positions, mental shorthand. And finally, the extent and direction of elaboration or thinking. How much do they think? And does it tend to be biased or objective? Okay? Let's move on now to the fourth point. And the fourth point, we begin to meet our roots of persuasion. That there are routes that people follow in deciding, and by route I mean R-O-U-T-E, or a road. There are paths or routes that people follow when they're being persuaded. And this is the crucial thing that allowed them to resolve a lot of contradictory information. So number 4 talks about persuasive arguments. And persuasive arguments are a route to persuasion called the central route. The central route. Okay? And when people take the central route, what they do is they elaborate a lot, they elaborate in an objective way, they listen carefully, they think about things, and they look to logic and reasoning. Okay? And this is one way you would make a decision. Now, how does that happen? What happens? The story is that people receive a message and they decide how to process it. They're going to either process it on the central route, looking at persuasive arguments, or they're going to process it on the peripheral route, which is number 5 coming up. Right? These intangibles, previous beliefs, speaker identity, source attractiveness, images associated with the ideas. And people pick one and they take it. Okay? That's a decision you make right away. Am I going to process this along the central route or the peripheral route? Well, how do people make that decision? How do they decide which route to persuasion to take? Well, here are some ways in which they do that. The first one is personal relevance. Personal relevance. If something is really relevant to you, it's about you. Remember, if I talk about reducing your college loan burden by 50%, hey, that's probably really relevant to you. Right? You want to hear those arguments. You're going to listen carefully. But if I want to persuade you about the nature of a couple of strangely shaped rocks on Neptune, that's not personally relevant to you. You go, cool, rocks on Neptune, whatever. Right? You're not going to choose the central route in analyzing that unless you were an astronomical geologist who specialized in studying Neptune, and then you'd be interested. Why? Because it's relevant to you. Because that's your field, because that's what you're working on, right? And so when people think that ideas are important and personally relevant to them, then they're going to think about things carefully. New information is another thing that triggers the central route. Now, I use the word trigger because remember, the message comes to you, you decide how you're going to process it, central route, peripheral route. And if the message says it is important, it is relevant, but also it has new information, right? And so I would want to make my little talk relevant. So I would say, hi, college students, you have lots of loans you may have to pay back. I want to talk to you about ways that you can reduce your loan burden. And I have some new ideas that you may not know about. So at this point, you're like, You're leaning forward. You're listening. Okay, we could reduce my loan burden. It's something I don't know. I think I better listen to this guy. Right? That's how that works. So new information is one way to trigger the central route. On this route, comprehension and understanding is very important. If the audience doesn't comprehend your persuasive arguments, reasons, evidence, logical connections, they're not going to work for them. You can't say, ladies and gentlemen, it's really clear that we can either bring our lunch or walk to school. And it's like, huh, what? Where is that? Right? Or you can say, now, the secret to reducing your loan burden is the interstitial fiduciary obligations, which can be reversed and further manipulated. You don't understand that. I hope you don't, because it didn't make any sense. So that if you're really on the central route and someone's not making a good argument, not using good evidence, not making sense, you would reject it. So comprehension and understanding, when you're on the central route, you need the audience to understand what you're saying and to internalize it. But that's not always true. We'll see on the peripheral route that's not necessarily true. Finally, what you get with persuasive arguments or the central route is usually objective elaboration. People will try to look at multiple sides of the issue, think about all the persuasive arguments on every side, and then make a decision. So you basically get objective elaboration. So that's number 4. Persuasive arguments, or the central route. Please remember, the message comes, you decide how to process it. You either pick the central route or the peripheral route. So a lot of these things have to happen very early in the communication, because that's when people are going to decide. Okay, number 4, persuasive arguments, the central route, personal relevance, new information. That's how you get them on it. Once you get them on that route, you have to make sure they comprehend and understand the points you're making. And then when they do, they're engaged in objective elaboration. Probably a good amount of elaboration, and it's done in an objective way. Let's go to premise number 5, the peripheral cues. Yes, there is another route to persuasion, the peripheral route. And this contains a lot of the things I've talked about. Source focus. Hi, I'm Paris Hilton. You want to be beautiful and skinny like me. What you need is, right? Or, if somebody, and this is why in a lot of instances, famous sports personalities go on to be coaches and trainers. Just like, who do you want to listen to talk to you about football strategy? Joe Montana? Yeah, one of the most successful, quarterbacks ever, who had exceptional strategic abilities. Sure, you would listen to him. You wouldn't necessarily listen to me, right? Because I'm, never led a football, never been on a football team. Don't know anything about football strategy. So the source focus can be a peripheral cue. Now, Joe Montana might say, you need to run this play because of this, that, and the other, and say something ridiculous. But you might go, okay, Joe, yep. Joe, he knows what he's saying, right? So I'm gonna go with this, even if it's not making much sense to you. Wonder why they use celebrities to sell products? Now you know, because when you see a celebrity, you go, okay, I'm gonna believe what Joe Montana says. I'm gonna believe what Oprah Winfrey says. I'm gonna believe what Paris Hilton says. And so source focus takes the nexus away from the persuasive arguments and onto something else. And so when Oprah tells you this is going to make your marriage happy, this is going to help you lose weight, etc. The fact that she has crappy arguments, she may get away with it because you're focused on the source. Next, intangibles or associations are peripheral route cues. For example, and many advertising techniques do this. You take two things and you associate them with each other. And one of my favorite examples is Newport cigarettes. Now, they're cigarettes. It's tobacco. It's rolled into a tube. You suck on it. It gets you, a buzz from the nicotine or whatever. But over the decades, what Newport has done is they have an advertising campaign that always associates with the beach, the sun, young people having fun, and they've got Newport cigarettes. Right? So you associate one thing with another, and after decades of the same campaign, There's, oh yeah, Newport, it's like happy, happy, beach, joy, joy, young people, whatever. Now, remember, does that make much sense? No, it doesn't. But remember, this is the peripheral route. People are not looking for the arguments and the evidence. They're just doing associations. And so you have, I mean, are people motivated by sex? Yes. So it's no wonder that so many products use sex to try to sell them. Right? They use that as an association, which is a peripheral cue. And these associations are fairly intangible. Nobody makes the argument, oh, if you smoke Newports, you will go to the beach and have fun on a sunny day with young people. No. No one's making that argument blatantly. Just like quite often they're not making the blatant argument, oh, if you use this hair shampoo, you'll get sex. It's not done that directly. It's done sort of in an intangible way. Oh, she uses it, then her hair is shiny, and then the guy she likes starts to smile at the office, starts to smile at her. It sounds like any one of 100 of different advertisements you've seen. Then there are images and symbols. Images and symbols are very powerful, whether it's the dollar sign, the cross of Jesus, the pale crescent of the Prophet Muhammad, if it's the Nazi swastika, if it's, who knows? There's a lot of symbols that have power. And, you know, if I give a speech about how we're going to reduce your college debt, and behind me is a giant Nazi swastika, you're like, what? What's that all about? I don't know what that symbol is. Right? And the flag's a good example, right? There's the thing in the election that they had all these little paper flags at the Democratic convention, and after they cleaned up, there was a lot on the left, they threw them away. Well, John McCain's supporters went and dug them out of the trash. They had flag rescue, right? And now they're making, we rescued flags. Okay, big deal. Flags are not alive. They weren't hurting. They're just a little piece of paper. There's no big deal. But they make it a symbolic argument, which becomes a peripheral cue by using images and symbols. Another strategy on the peripheral route is to use confusion, lack of comprehension, and understanding. Confusion, lack of comprehension, and understanding. I was stunned to learn that many persuasive techniques confuse the audience on purpose. That's because they want their focus to be somewhere else. And I'll just give you an example. I'm an expert on nuclear power plants. I have a PhD in nuclear physics, and I'm giving a talk to you about whether Vermont Yankee is dangerous or not. Okay? And I would begin the speech by telling you how I'm an expert, I've been doing it for so many years, right? Because I want the peripheral route. That's my design. So I begin by focusing on me as the source, right? You should believe me. That's why anybody who you think's a skillful persuader, who begins by giving you their background and what they've done and what they've earned, means they're trying to put you on the peripheral route. So it should, raise little warning flags. So then, I'm giving my talk and I say, well, you don't have to worry about there being an accident at Vermont Yankee Power Plant because they have nickel cadmium infused platelets that are attached to critical variables in the fuel rods, which means that an emergency core cooling system failure can't happen. And then the result of that is that it means that we can't have an accident because of those factors. Now, did you understand that? No. In fact, it might have been said in a confusing way, meaning to confuse yourself. So here's what happens. If you're on the peripheral route and you go, wow, I didn't understand that. Okay, well, But he's an expert in nuclear physics, so he must know what he's talking about. So I'm going to accept it. Because you're on the peripheral route, right? Source focus works for you. Let's take another example. If I was giving you a talk about how you can reduce your loan burden, right? Very important to you. I have new information. And then at some point I confuse you. You're listening carefully. You're critically analyzing the arguments, and all of a sudden I'm confusing, not making any sense. You're going to go, whoa, okay. Whatever. I'm not going with this. Sorry, I ain't. I'm not buying into your plan, right? Because it doesn't make sense. But if you're on the peripheral route and you had a source focus and people confuse you, you go, oh yeah, that expert, he knows what he's talking about. And here's what people don't want to do. Let's go back to that Vermont Yankee bunch of cadmium inflated platelets, whatever, all that nonsense. You don't want to go, hey, I didn't understand that. What are you talking about? Right? Because that would make you look stupid. Right? You don't want to point out to everyone you're stupid. Because you're on the peripheral route. I don't want to look bad. It's not that important to me. But if you were on the central route, right, and I was trying to fool you about reducing your lumber, and you go, hey, that doesn't make any sense. You better re-explain that or else I'm out of here. Right? Because it's very important to you. And the peripheral route works best on things that are not ultimately a crisis situation or absolutely essential for you. When people think about ideas on the peripheral route, they usually use biased elaboration. Okay, what do I already know? Okay, that's fine. Oh, what he's saying goes along with what I already know and I already think. Great. So the peripheral route is where you play on and use the biases that people have, their previous positions, their associations. And so you want to get biased elaboration because it's going to get, you want to use what they already believe to help your message. And that's biased elaboration. Finally, repetition is very useful on the peripheral route. McDonald's, I'm loving it. Okay, there's the slogan, I'm loving it. What's it associated with? Me loving it. Okay, and if you say it a billion times and it gets repeated so often, people are like, McDonald's, I'm loving it. The number of times, I've asked debaters, where should we stop and have lunch? And they'll go, I'm loving it, is insane. And debaters are probably less brainwashed by the McDonald's peripheral cue heavy persuasion than a lot of people. So repetition instead of word. Keep saying it, and people who aren't thinking deeply may start believing it. Of course, keep saying it, and people who are thinking deeply, you can say that 1,000 times, and I'm not going to buy it. Because I'm examining it critically. I'm using a persuasive arguments approach. Okay? So those are peripheral cues. Number 6, elaboration. Elaboration. And we know that that's thinking. Right? How much will people think about something? It's determined by their motivation. If you're really motivated to think about something, you'll think about it a lot. If you're not motivated to think about something, you won't. Remember, you're surrounded by countless inputs every day. You can't think about them all. So you pick the ones that you're motivated to think about and think about those. When people elaborate but they're not that motivated, the most you get is biased elaboration. Okay? When people are highly motivated, what you tend to get is objective elaboration. Because objective elaboration takes more cognitive energy than biased elaboration. With biased elaboration, say, okay, what do I already think? McCain's awesome. Right? But with objective elaboration, we say, well, McCain is good for these reasons, and then let's see, what could the reasons be against it? You go that extra step to dig deeper when you're highly motivated to use objective elaboration. Obviously, on the peripheral route, you want biased elaboration. And on the central root, you want objective elaboration. Number 7. Central trades off with peripheral. Central trades off with peripheral. This is one thing students always have a hard time with. And the studies show people pick which way to process the message, and that's how they process it. If you think you can get them to switch roots from the central to the peripheral in the middle, that's not going to work. If you centrally engage them and then all of a sudden focus on a bunch of peripheral cues, hi, I'm Paris Hilton carrying a swastika, and that's not going to work. Nor can you start them on the peripheral route and then think you can move them to the central route later on. No. You have to trigger the route you want early in the message. That's the first thing that happens. I want to trigger the route you're on and then follow through on it. Okay? That central trades off with peripheral. You can't do both at the same time. And people will decide early on, and then that's the one they're on. If you trigger the central route, they're on it, and then all of a sudden you start talking nonsense, what happens? They stop listening to you altogether. Okay? Or if you're if you trigger the peripheral route, you're cute, you're showing some skin, you're famous, whatever, you're using associations and what they already believe, and then all of a sudden you try to shift over to complex arguments, evidence, rational connections, that's not going to work, right? Because they'll still be staring at your skin. Number 8, and finally for today, in many ways central root persuasion is better, but it's harder to get. It's harder to get. Central root persuasion lasts longer. It lasts longer. If I convince you through central root that John McCain would be very bad for America, then that's likely to last longer than a peripheral root message that says, oh, Barack Obama, and I mean Obama to a great extent uses a lot of peripheral root messages, and I think sometimes he's trying to mix the two together. But change that you achieve through persuasion in the cognitive elements of others is longer lasting if it's through the central route than if it's through the peripheral route. Next, it tends to lead to more behavioral change. It tends to lead to more behavioral change. People are more likely to follow through on the cognitive elements that have been readjusted through behavior than they are if it's done through the peripheral route. And finally, they're more resistant to counter-persuasion. They're more resistant to counter-persuasion. You try to persuade them of one thing, and somebody else comes along and tries to persuade them of something completely different. To the extent that you use the central route to do this, your subjects who have been persuaded will be able to resist, whereas they won't be able to resist nearly as well with peripheral route, right? I mean, on the peripheral route, Paris Hilton says, vote for John McCain, right? And then somebody else equally famous, although I don't know who would be more famous than Paris, then you get whatever. I don't follow stars. You get somebody else famous, and they're like, oh yeah, but this person thinks that Obama would be better. Oprah Winfrey, right? Thinks that Obama would be better. Okay, you're more likely to change your mind than if you use the central route. This is the theory you must know. You need to know it, you need to understand it, and we need to work at learning to apply it to given situations, because this is the basis of much of what we're going to be learning through the next of the year. So if you didn't read that article, you better read it. If you didn't listen to this video, you're making a mistake, right? Because it's going to be hard to understand the whole rest of the course unless you're down with the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion. Now on Tuesday, we're going to talk about how to trigger it, how to use it, how to follow through on these given routes of persuasion. And that's what we're going to do then. I look forward to seeing you. I'm ready to come home. I've had enough of Washington, D.C. And I look forward to seeing you live in class on Tuesday morning. And there we go. Thanks a lot.